All right, welcome everyone. We have a couple more people trying to join and get their audio connected, so we'll get started in just another minute. But please, while you wait, type your name and jurisdiction into the chat box, and please also indicate if your community has an elder abuse CCR already. All right, welcome. Looks like we can go ahead and get started. My name is Alicia Lord. I'm with the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. We're facilitating today, and I'm just going to go over a few things about the platform and kind of the flow of the day, and then I'll turn it over to the presenters. So if your name is showing as a name other than your actual name, if it's an agency name or some initials or an email, please right click on your video and click rename so that we can call on you by your actual name and know who's in the room. We will be having a poll today, as well as some interaction with the chat box and using the whiteboard feature. So please feel free to use the chat box at any time. And you can also raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted and engage in the discussion. If you do have any technical or audio issues today, please put that in the chat and I'll private message you and we can get that squared away so that you can fully participate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kylan to introduce our presenters.
Just wanted to unmute myself officially. I want to thank you guys for joining us this afternoon. We have the great Candace Heisler with us today. She's been with us and to produce many of webinars that we've had. So you guys are well familiar with her, but just to give you a background, she has served as the Assistant District Attorney for the City and County of San Francisco for over 25 years, heading their domestic violence, charging misdemeanor and preliminary hearing units. She was an adjunct professor at the Hastings College of Law for more than 20 years. And again, I want to thank Candace for being here today. And we have our very own Lisa Furr. She is now the Technical Assistance Advisor for the National Enhanced Multidisciplinary Team at Lifespan of Greater Rochester. Prior to being with Lifespan, Lisa worked with the program manager for the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, assisting in developing trainings and resources for individuals in the elder abuse community. I'm now going to pass it off to our presenters as we're going to start this joint venture in learning about CCRs and E-MDTs, and I'm very happy and excited for this webinar. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you, Kylan. So we just wanted to give everyone a chance to put their name and jurisdiction into the chat box and answer whether or not they have an elder abuse CCR in your community. We know that you all have enhanced multidisciplinary teams because you're on this grant. So we're grateful for that and hope that we can spend some time talking together today. So let's move forward. We just want to say thanks to OBC for the opportunity to do this work and let you know that the work presented in this webinar is from Candy and I and not from OBC. We are doing a recording on this. You check that box, and I will be sending out the slides later on today or tomorrow, cleaning it up a little bit so you don't have a lot of the unnecessary slides, but you will be able to receive the slides with the email with the detail in them in addition to the webinar recording. So, welcome, and we are grateful to have you here. We want this to be a conversation between Candy and I, and also a conversation between Candy and I and you as a group, and also hopefully with you to each other. We're going to be looking at, as Kylan and Alicia said, E-MDTs and CCRs. Our learning objectives are here. We're looking at the similarities and the differences between E-MDTs and CCRs, with the focusing on the importance of both. And the most important piece is to how to strengthen the interactions between the two, because Candy and I feel strongly that they're two sides of the same coin. They're the way of moving this issue forward and addressing abuse in later life, elder abuse in your community. And so we're very excited to do that. You were sent prior to the registration, the case study, and I'll let Candy kind of take it from there.
Thank you, Lisa. And from my side of the country here in California, good morning to those of you in more distant places. A very good afternoon. I want to thank those of you who sat through the webinar last month for being brave enough to come back. I really enjoyed last month, but we're going in a very different direction today. And it's a direction that's near and dear to my heart, because I'm going to echo some of what Lisa said. I think if we're really going to wrap our heads around the complexities of elder abuse, we need to look at it on the ground. And that's where I think about E-MDTs. But then we also need to look at it from 10 or 30,000 feet, which is where I think CCRs fit in. So let's turn quickly. I hope you've all got the case study of Ava in front of you and had a chance to think about the questions that you were asked. For those of you who might not have looked at Ava in the last day or so, and I can't imagine anything was more important than reading this case, I'm just going to review it very, very quickly. So the person who is suspected of being harmed is Ava. She's 68 years old. She lives with her caregiver son, who's 45 years old. He is receiving in-home supportive service funds to serve as her caregiver. The reporting party that launched all of this is a concerned neighbor who's noticed that Ava has appeared from time to time looking both unkempt, uncharacteristically unkempt, and malnourished. But when the neighbor has tried on a number of occasions to interact with Ava, the son has interfered and prevented the interaction. APS initially was involved, and they had a hard time getting in the house. The son refused to let them in. Initially, he claimed to hold the power of the— How you doing? Hello? Okay. APS had difficulty gaining entry initially. The son, claiming the authority under the POA for healthcare and finances, said APS couldn't come in. He reluctantly allowed them to enter when told they could get a court order and come back with the police. Once APS did gain entry, they noticed a very strong odor of human waste. When they saw Ava, they noticed that she was withdrawn, wearing dirty clothes, and looking malnourished. In the attempt to converse with her, they found that it was a difficult situation. She was unable to answer most questions, and they could not effectively conduct a cognitive screen. The son says he is mom's caregiver. He also handles their funds, but refused to share any records showing expenditures. So a number of records checks are completed, and a number of records are secured. And collectively, on the medical side, they reveal multiple hospitalizations over the last 2 years. And noteworthy are there were hospitalizations based on delirium, and in one case, broken bones, with no further information. Ava has been prescribed a lot of different kinds of medications in order to treat her high blood pressure, diabetes, She's had sedatives to help with sleep and opioids. But when a little deeper dive was done, it was observed that only the last two, the sedatives and opiates, were regularly refilled and perhaps more often than they should have been. Financial records indicate that Ava, between her pension and Social Security, she was a longtime Postal Service employee, has a monthly income of about $5,000. And prior to the son assuming the role of caregiver over finances, her income was more than ample to cover her needs. And in fact, she was able to save about $500 a month. More recently, since her son has taken over, monthly expenditures are around $8,000 a month. And many of those expenditures would be not anything that would assist Ava directly. Things like airplane trips, a motorcycle, and paying off a loan for the son's child. And then finally, we do have some information that the son has a criminal history of sorts, though he's not currently on any sort of supervision. So against that backdrop, if you could advance our slide, please. We asked you to consider these two questions: putting on your hat as an E-MDT representative, what issues could you discuss in your E-MDT? And then what is important within this scenario that would not be something you could properly address within the E-MDT? Lisa is going to put up a whiteboard, and we're going to ask you to tell us what you came up with. What were some of your ideas? So are you ready to go with the whiteboard?
Yes, but it disappeared.
Well, while it's disappearing, I suggest that folks unmute themselves and either just call out at an opportune moment your ideas for what issues your E-MDT, focus only on the first question, what issues could your E-MDT address? And please remember, you can call out or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, but please remember to unmute yourselves. So the easier question, what could your E-MDT talk about and address in Ava's case?
This is y'all's part.
I'll give it a go for just a couple of quick pieces. I think it'd be interesting to talk to law enforcement and maybe some of the folks who work with forensic accountants to go back through and do a deep dive of what's happened since he took over as power of attorney. It also might be helpful to talk to folks about trying to determine if they're able to look back and get a history of when she had her last cognitive assessment. Kind of a full medical workup if that hasn't already been done. I know they looked at prescription records and some other pieces, but trying to get an idea of maybe when that cognitive decline started, when she signed over that paperwork. I would also think trying to make sure that there's other eyes on her in the house, determining maybe what services could be put in place or where she might be able to be placed so that there is guarantees of care might be something as well.
So if I'm hearing you, you're in the last situation, you're considering either new eyes who might be providing caregiver services or possibly a different housing option. Is that fair to say? Based
off the initial APS feedback saying that the conditions did not seem to be good, that she was malnourished, there was a strong smell of human waste, and that medications didn't seem to be filled other than the narcotics. It seems like the care that he's providing currently is not appropriate to meet her needs. So they're related to that within the team. What kinds of potential
options might the team be able to suggest? And that's a question for anybody.
Good morning. This is
Morning,
Bonnie.
Benita.
So we're talking about power of attorney. Are we saying that this person is not cognitive? And who is not cognitive, and who does the power of attorney cover? Because power of attorney doesn't go into effect until that person isn't cognitive anymore.
That could be true in some states, and others it can be, it isn't considered springing, it's durable, which means in some cases, in my state, for example, it is actually effective on signing, even if the person who's protected under it maintains a level of capacity. But you make a really good point that in many situations, that person, that power of attorney might not be able to be executed by the agent until a finding of incapacity. So there's some investigation. Are you suggesting some investigation of the nature of the power of attorney?
I was just wondering who it covers. It says there's maybe I didn't read it right, but I know there's Ava in the home and then another, her husband.
So if I can perhaps clarify, Ava is the principal, the person who gave the authority, and the agent or attorney in fact, as it's called in some states, is the son. So those are the only two parties involved in this POA.
So also Anna Thompson jumped in and shared that to look at why the hospital and no one there made an APS referral or asked Ava a few important questions. So hospital issues, I'm going to put /APS/
Well, I think even just generally hospital reporting duties.
Well, now where did it go? There it is.
And Brenda, you're absolutely correct. There are multiple kinds of POAs. In our situation, it is allegedly both healthcare and financial.
Okay, so if we'll assume that it's healthcare and financial. So as the power of attorney, if this person is able to act, maybe they didn't know that there are other programs that can come in and help with the healthcare and then assist. Because sometimes it looks like there's someone that's and maybe the elder says, don't let him in.
Could very well be. It's a really good point.
But upon an interview, you would ask these questions. And do you know that there are programs out there to help with the care of your elder? And maybe the elder doesn't want the son to touch her body. Maybe she wants to be independent and try to take care of herself. So in that case, you would get somebody else to come in, like a female. Because sometimes females just want to be, private. Sometimes males want to be private. So
so the E-MDT might be able, are you saying, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is your point that amongst the members of the E-MDT discussing alternative caregivers, especially for personal care, might be something to explore?
Yes, when they interview, I think that, don't jump to conclusions, but keep your eyes open. Always be on the alert. Anything like that, I would, if I was an interviewer or a social worker and going into a situation like that, I would definitely be looking around, and then also have like a checklist of all of the resources in your area, and maybe that power of attorney just agreed, thought it was being helpful, and then just listening to the elder on what the elder's wishes are, because under a power of attorney, you have to really take into consideration the person that you are power of attorney over. You have to take their wishes into consideration and put them first. And there's also gets to be the difficult part where are their decisions the healthiest? But then as a power of attorney, you know, it's tricky. It's really tricky. It's hard. I know that. I was the power of attorney for before, and you have family coming at you, you have everything coming at you, but you have to really make sure that you understand the responsibilities of being a power of attorney. It is a
So
responsibility.
if I'm also understanding subtext, perhaps it is also getting interviewing the son about his understanding of the power of attorney and his ability to carry out his responsibilities.
Right.
And
Because
maybe he would like to be relieved.
right, he might want to. I mean, there are several times I wanted to. I know that. It's
So-
difficult.
So Candy, I wanted to bring in a few other folks on the power of
Please.
attorney. Brenda from Michigan pointed out the different types of power of attorney and how that comes to play here, and making sure to involve that. Earlier, Anna had mentioned the training opportunity with hospitals, and I'm going to move the training piece over to the CCR, but kind of leave it more to the middle. And then there were some other things. Bernadette is consider involving probate court, considering temporary guardianship and conservatorship. So I'm going to add that in.
So the E-MDT can certainly explore if this is a case for which proceeding down at least a temporary guardianship / conservatorship proceeding or proceedings might be needed. Certainly, we have some concerns about Ava's capacity right now. And we don't know if those are temporary or permanent, but they could certainly be something that right now needs to be addressed. And Brenda reminded us that community agencies and AAAs can perhaps provide some caregivers to help with Ava's needs. Anybody else want to talk about what you would address in the E-MDT discussion of this case?
So are we determining if it goes under E-MDT or CCR?
Right
Or-
now, we're only focusing on the E-MDT side. We're going to shift in a few minutes to the CCR side.
The only thing I might, and this kind of gets covered under care and some of the things that Benita mentioned about asking if the caretaker was aware of services, but maybe like a Meals on Wheels program or some type of, assessment of her nutritional needs, and then maybe provision to help supplement, to simplify that.
Certainly, programs like Meals on Wheels and other programs could fill the gaps that may be contributing to malnutrition and confusion, and could be additionally another set of eyes in the house. Really good idea. Okay, you know from the introductions that I bring a criminal justice perspective on this. Are there any criminal justice considerations that might be raised in the E-MDT in this matter?
I would say yes, that to me, there's some red flags with the son not allowing access into the home with the condition of his mother, with potentially some of the financial pieces, there may be an opportunity to have law enforcement look into some things, or maybe collaborate on interviewing the alleged perpetrator once some of the other immediate needs of the client are taken care of.
And I think you make a really valuable set of points. The first being the immediate concern is the welfare and safety of the client, and making sure that that her needs are addressed, and figuring out what's the best way to do that in the moment, and then shorter, middle term, and then long term. The other is to get more background information that will shed a light on, is there some culpability here? Bernadette points out that we do have a son who's got a history of arrest and drug convictions. There is a concern about the medication, the speed at which the opioids and the other drugs that are likely to be abused are being refilled. And so law enforcement might well be needing to step in and do some interviews, collect some evidence, possibly serve search warrants on the home, and so on. So yes, thinking about, are there potential criminal elements of this case? What else might your E-MDT discuss? Is there anything further?
Probably the condition of the home. If you can go into a home and you smell, you know, that the house isn't clean and you're smelling human waste, what is the problem?
And again, that may be a matter of some community cleanup services, or there may be family members who can come in and do a serious clean. But yes, we need to figure out, is the house habitable and is it safe?
One other thing that I would add too, and then I'll let somebody else take the floor a little bit and talk, is that Kai Lin has trained me very well on the AIM model. So the one thing we haven't talked too much about was, we've talked a lot about the behaviors potentially with the trusted other, the son, the caretaker, but we haven't talked about trying to engage him in services. I know locally we are very lucky to have kind of a CCR of a different sort to respond to opiate needs and overdoses in a non-punitive way, but really offering supports and intervention. So that might be something that we could consider. Even supports for just him as a caregiver, is trying to manage that all on his own. Sometimes even with that approach with law enforcement, I've seen them take that and they end up getting a confession of all the other criminal activity that's taken place. So it is looking at his needs as well. If the older adult was to remain in the home, is what supports could we offer him that would improve outcomes for the older adult, and then also reduce risk ongoing.
I completely agree. When I was thinking about this case, I like you, thought, is this a situation where the son really is trying to do the best he can? And is he dealing with his own personal difficulties, for which offers of assistance, whether it be treatment or counseling, mental health services, etc., if available, might be helpful in ameliorating the situation. So I'm very glad that you added that. If anyone else wants to add something before we transition over thinking about what are things you can't really handle in the course of your E-MDT, please jump in now. Hearing nothing and seeing nothing new in the chat, let's answer the second question, which is, what issues have you identified that really are beyond what you're able to really address through the E-MDT, but are perhaps broader issues that could be sent over to a CCR?
So we've got the training opportunity with the hospital that was in Anna, put that in with her stuff in the chat.
And is the hospital really the only training opportunity that is suggested by this case study? Are there other training opportunities that you see in this case?
I see some potentially that might be necessary, even like a cross training with law enforcement, because a lot of times that power of attorney piece can be super confusing. Honestly, it's confusing for most everyone involved many times, including the people who sign the paperwork. So that potentially, I also think Meals on Wheels folks are just are heroes of sorts. I see a lot of opportunities to cross-train them because of the nature of the work that they do. They could be a huge support, not only to that older adult, but I would say any of the parties trained to help that older adult as well.
Excellent idea. What about the money? Were there any missed clues or cues that could benefit from some cross training?
I see that law enforcement is understaffed and doesn't have the resources to fully investigate, but maybe they're, we can talk about in the CCR what other opportunities we have to help them with that maybe they didn't know about, or, why it's still important to hold the offender accountable in these situations and look at, is there other types of abuse going on? I know, like, it sounds like there's some neglect and everything as well. And even if he's the only caretaker, he's not really taking care of her. So that's still a problem.
So if I'm following, and I think you've made some really important points, we also need at a higher level than the E-MDT to better understand the police staffing shortages, what the agency priorities are, and perhaps use something like the CCR to try to identify alternatives or to support requests for additional funding, or to have the police take another look at their priorities. What about, I'm going to go back to my question about, what about
Anna added in that perhaps the prosecutor's office?
Absolutely. And I think it's both on, this may not be merely civil, so the potential criminal aspects, and I'm going to suggest as well, they may need some cross training on one of the hardest kinds of cases to prove, and that's neglect. Do you think that the bank may have missed an opportunity to bring this situation forward earlier?
So Denise put the bank and the pharmacy in the chat.
Thank you. Good.
And I'll just say that I forgot what the name of them are, but the National Pharmacy Group has some amazing videos on misuse of drugs and the abuse that might happen around that. They're just some amazing ones, and when I've trained some pharmacy students, I've used those as well. Candy, I'm just going to do a time check. It's 1:35.
I know that, and I'm about to move this along. I think you've come up with a really thoughtful list of some of what you really can do and some of what it's going to take someone operating at a higher responsibility level, looking beyond the confines of a single case to more broadly about systems, identifying those differences. And on that note, I'm going to pass this on. We're not going to lose this information. We're going to revisit it later on, but we'll shift over to talking about some of the differences and the similarities between E-MDTs and CCRs. So Lisa, I think this is you.
It is. And let me get back to the screen for 1 moment and get rid of that. And then we are sharing, we're sharing. I want to make, did you get the, there we are.
You're in the right place, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Let me get my chat back up so I can see that. So what we're looking at now, we've kind of done the case study review of the nitty gritty from the whole aspect of that. What we're going to look at now is the parts of these two groups that make them unique and make them similar. And so let's look then at how unique these two groups are. So to quote from, and I hate reading from a slide, but I do want to stick to the OVC grant definition that y'all are working off of. Case review E-MDTs are defined as a group of professionals composed of representatives from 3 or more disciplines who work together collaboratively, bound by a common purpose. The team has a shared goal and shared definition of the problem they are addressing and is characterized by the shared decision-making, partnership, and interdependency. So what we're looking at here is that the purpose of the case review is to be client and victim focused. Therefore, the focus is on the individual case, and because of that, confidentiality is paramount. Therefore, because you're focused on the client, the victim, the individual, you may meet more frequently than some other groups might. It might be as needed if you have a crisis case come up and you need the help from your team. It might be scheduled twice a month or once a month, but it's going to be live and active and lively rather instead, so that you're really focusing on an ongoing relationship between the agencies that are involved in the various cases, and you're really exploring how you can help this particular individual, this particular family. So then looking at CCRs, Candy?
Thank you. So in contrast, I started talking earlier about the view on the ground and then the view at 10 or 30,000 feet. The CCR is that 10,000 or 30,000 foot view, because it's focusing not on individual cases, but on the systems that need to work together and coordinate to identify ways to improve at the community level how systems need to better respond. You sometimes hear discussion of, we're developing a seamless response to elder abuse, and that is greater than any single case. The membership typically tends to be broader, and this is really a time where instead of having some worker bees, and I mean that in the most respectful way, instead of necessarily just having worker bees, the CCR really needs to have the support of decision makers. So that may be electeds, it may be appointed heads of agencies, heads of divisions, because the decisions they are going to make are going to be ones that affect how agencies respond. Communication is open and it is not confidential. So in general terms, there are no confidentiality agreements by CCRs, and that means they shouldn't be talking about the specifics of any case. They may meet monthly, quarterly, or yearly. They decide for themselves, and they may be lodged the E-MDT can be part of a CCR. It can be one of the committees, but the MDT can also find its way as part of a forensic center or justice center. And in that sense, there may be some differences. Next slide. Having said how they're a little different, there also are things they both do. And many CCRs and E-MDTs do training and outreach. The training in particular may be more in the nature of cross-training of members. There may be outreach to community players. There also may be outreach to increase membership on the CCR. Both typically have MOUs and some kind of fixed relationship or agreed upon relationship between members. Both should be, and importantly, must address racial equity, and both will benefit from participation from underserved communities in the area or region. An important point is at least those CCRs and or E-MDTs receiving federal funds, those funds cannot be used to lobby for individuals, for example, for a political campaign or for legislative change. But it is appropriate for both to use what they understand to educate about the issue. So an example that would distinguish what you can't do from what you can. So regarding lobbying, we have recognized that in our state or in our community, the mandatory reporting laws just are not doing their job, and there are too many important groups who are not required to report. And we think reporting would improve response and identification of issues. In general, that federally funded CCR or MDT cannot lobby for new laws. However, they can educate, and that would be along the lines of, you know, here's the current state of law about reporting laws. You'll notice that only certain professionals are required to report. Others, such as pick your target, are not mandated reporters. That's an example of the line between advocacy and education. Be aware that even if the CCR can do some of this legislating or lobbying using other funds, individual members, and the group that always jumps out at me are judges, may be prohibited from participating in individual activities related to law changes and the like. So on that note, Lisa, do you want to summarize some of our differences between the two?
Certainly. So as Candy mentioned, you might have the same organizations involved, and indeed you should, but you're looking at frontline folks. She called them worker bees, boots on the ground, the folks handling the client services. And for the systems change work with the CCR, you want the folks who can be policy people, who can institute that policy. And unless they're a small organization, those will most likely be different individuals. You don't want people on the CCR that say, oh, I have to take it back. And then it can be months before the CCR gets an answer around that, around the issue. For the same happening, you don't want an executive director who's not involved with the details of the day-to-day client services that their agency might provide on the E-MDT, who's not knowledgeable about the nitty-gritty day-to-day services that the tricks of the trade, if you will, that their case manager could have at his or her fingertips and that they would be able to offer up immediately. And so that's something that you're thinking about that. And as we've highlighted, the frequency of meetings. CCRs probably, unless there's a huge horrific case that's all over the news, CCRs are not likely to need emergency meetings. MDTs may very well need meetings that are called at spur of a moment or something along those lines. Now let's look at some of the research that we have in an article that Candy found.
So rather than reading you 2 slides, and since you're all going to have access to the slides, let me just suggest that a lot of the discussions we are having today are really closely track these findings from the National Center on Elder Abuse study conducted in 2011 that really try to distinguish CCRs and how they do their work. And I think it's a useful thing to come back to as you're examining what's going on in your individual communities. So on that note, let's quickly move to our next slide. And Lisa?
So what we're going to do is we want to talk again, and we really want y'all to talk with each other, with us. And use the chat if you prefer. What are some of those other teams or groups that exist in your community, and how do you interact with them, or if you do? So what are some groups that that your communities have?
Well, we have like our sexual assault response teams, our domestic violence task forces, and you know, there can sometimes be some overlap. Like we have an MDT for our sexual assault response team too. So if the person, the elder was sexually assaulted, it's possible it could be reviewed at 2 different case review meetings. But since we tend to coordinate all of those, we at least usually have some idea if that's happening. So we can kind of
Lisa, are
choose
the
what to do.
same people on both of all 3 of those groups?
We have different people who coordinate. Sometimes it might be the same detectives because you have, for example, your special victims unit of the larger police department here, they would handle elder abuse, DV, children's, things like that. And then you have some smaller jurisdictions where they only have like 2 or 3 detectives. And so it's whoever's available. Yeah.
Right. How about anybody else? Anything outside the domestic and sexual violence field?
We have a crisis intervention unit that goes out with our fire department and our police department. They are a part of our MDT as well, but sometimes we go out together. I go out with them. We also have new positions within our police department. Denver Police Department has 6 districts, and each district has a community coordinator. And so that particular individual goes out with a police officer, and sometimes there's some overlap. Then we also have our victim advocates within the police department or the prosecuting agency, the district attorney or the city attorney.
Excellent. So are any of those teams or individuals part of a larger coordinated response that you're I mean, the CIT, the crisis intervention team, do they triage their cases? Do they meet on a regular basis, or is it the individuals who are assigned to a case or a call?
So each one has their own district, so they're assigned to a call. I'm not sure what their meetings look like or how they staff their cases because they're completely separate. But we do have individuals from that team who attend our MDT. And I heard all the details on the MDT and the CCR, and I got to be honest, it's very confusing for me because we only have an MDT and we coordinate from there and people go out and do what they need to do. We have a response. And so I don't really quite grasp the difference between the two, although you've listed different things. I feel like we do it all. So I apologize, but each unit does their own thing, but we also, like I said, have them participate in the MDT and sometimes we collaborate.
Okay. Anybody
I
else?
think we're going to come back to that issue very shortly because I
Yes, yes.
suspect you may not be the only person who has a single team that's trying to do both.
Anybody else have any groups that exist in their community? Laura, you've got another E-MDT that you tag team with or work with on sometimes. Are there other coordinated community responses or any other groups that operate in your area, in that county, in that area of your county?
Lisa, were you referring to did you say Laura?
Yes, I'm totally.
Oh, okay. It's okay. I just wanted to make sure you were referring to me. We do not collaborate. Well, I guess we have our Family Justice Center that is MDT for all ages of survivors of DV, any type of violent crime, any traumatic crime. So we do have one of the members that participates on that team is also a member on our team as well. So in that aspect, yes. And then within our county, we have a larger MDT that does other parts or parts of Los Angeles County where we're very specific to the San Fernando Valley and Santa Clarita areas. So I take some information from there because they've been around for so many years. It's useful to be able to learn from them. So yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to put something in the chat here, the Elder Justice Network locator map, and I'll give you a website link to that in the later on, but there's a way that you can kind of look to see what else is going on in your community if you don't already know or have it at your fingertips, so that you can look at that. But always keep in mind too that there may be multiple underserved or cultural groups that exist to serve their community, and there may very well be. Here in Richmond, we have the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and they call themselves the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. We also have the Asian Chamber of Commerce. We also have some faith-based groups that are trying to do some overarching kind of things. So there are several different groups that might be available to you. So let's move on, I believe, to our next poll. Alicia, just to let you know it's coming up. So what we're looking at is if individuals are members of both the CCR and the E-MDT, are there potential issues? And so go ahead and click on the answer that you think applies to this. And if you have an idea of something that we did not list up there, go ahead and throw that in the chat and we can look at that.
And to be clear, can folks click more than a single button if they feel that's the best response?
So about half the folks have signed in. So let's get a few more a few more answers. Joe, do the Jeopardy music. Da, 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 da. So it looks like we've kind of stalled at about half the folks. Anybody else want to jump in there? And clearly, Alicia and Andy and I are not voting.
I don't see it on the screen anymore. I did answer it, but I don't see it on my screen, just FYI. I don't know if everybody else did.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll share the results in just a minute.
Okay. So can folks see it? All right, there we go. Can you see the results?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So confidentiality won out. Some folks say no issues exist. Ignoring boundaries, and folks may engage in prohibited activities. One of the things to keep in mind is if your community receives the OVW, Office of Violence Against Women, Abuse in Later Life Training Grant, you are prohibited on grant time for doing E-MDT work, but you are encouraged, if not required, to do CCR work. So that's a thought that you need to think about with that. All right. So let's go back to thinking about the case study and the conversations that we had on that, and the things that you identified. Thanks, Lynn, for pointing out that there was still some difficulty around what was and wasn't part of the E-MDT and part of the CCR. So if you are a member of the E-MDT, looking at that case with Ava, how would you communicate with the CCR? What would need to be said about the issues that the E-MDT can't address? So we talked about training issues, we talked about cross-training issues, we talked about issues around opioid issues, we talked about a number of different kinds of things that we're looking at. What are some of the things that you think that the CCR, and keep in mind the CCR is if you think about the client for the E-MDT is the person needing services, and the client for the CCR is your community. So what are the specific next step needs of the client is for the E-MDT? How can we make sure that the systems change piece happens so that that there are safety nets in place, there are structures and policies in place that prohibit it from happening again? So if that's helpful to you to kind of think of it in that terms. So from that, the case with Ava, what are some things that you see that the CCR would need to do that, and how would you go about communicating that? And who would communicate that?
If during the discussion of a case in the E-MDT, it's identified that there's a systemic issue that might need to be addressed or policies that need to be changed, that information can be communicated to folks who participate on the CCR, and some of them do overlap, like the prosecutor, for example, different people that might participate in both, or the E-MDT coordinator can share that information with me to discuss during CCR as well.
Right, so for example, the systematic piece, Elisa, that you mentioned, I think one of the things, if you find that the hospital is often not calling APS, that's a real issue for the community that needs to be addressed. The E-MDT calling up the hospital and saying, why didn't you call APS, isn't going to help Ava because she's already out of it. But the CCR addressing that systematic issue about, is it a lack of understanding around mandatory reporting for those folks not in New York State? Is it something that so it's always someone else's responsibility? Where is that? And that's something that the CCR would look at. Can anybody think of some other issues or suggestions? We're at 2 o'clock. Can people give us maybe 10 more minutes? If you need to jump off, we're gonna put a survey in the chat box, and I don't have that survey, Alicia, if you do, throw that in, but we're gonna go ahead and take about 10 more minutes. Let me go ahead and say some possible answers about a non-hospital emergency placement might be an issue. And so finding a place for Ava, then go ahead and look at that. What about when that ongoing issue when the caregiver is also the abuser? So if the abuser is arrested or taken in for treatment or services, what becomes of that individual? You know, again, looking at the method of communicating and providing a means of shared information feedback. So who is communicating to the CCR? You don't want every member of the E-MDT doing so. You would like to have E-MDT representation on the CCR. You'd like to have someone connected to that. You want to make sure that there's a pipeline. So let's go ahead and look at some of those. Candy?
So take a deep breath. And now we're putting you to work thinking about what have you done or what are some of the ideas you have for maximizing interactions between CCRs and E-MDTs. We've drawn some lines about where some of the problems are. Some of you may have already thought of solutions and have used them and they're working beautifully. We want to hear about that. So everyone go to the chat and everybody's going to have a moment to think about this question and type in your answers. So your ideas for improving and what have you seen that has worked. Please type, but do not hit enter until I ask you to. So we're going to give you just a moment to collect your thoughts. Please start typing in the chat, but do not hit enter. All right, go ahead and hit enter. And if you're still writing, just keep typing. But let's see what ideas have come forward from those of you who've had a moment. So Elisa, having a point person to share issues with the coordinated response team. Other ideas? Come on, I know there's some very brilliant people in this room with a lot of experience, and we really do want to learn from you. So please add another few thoughts about ideas. Fair enough, Laura.
So if you think back to some of those things that we identified with around the AVA issue that would be good things for the CCR to do.
So a further comment, our E-MDT, sorry, I just lost it here. Our MDT came from the work of our CCR, prior year's work. The E-MDT meets more often than the CCR, and I think it's working well. Very helpful. One more idea, and then we're going to give you some other ideas that we might have thought of. Okay, a collaborative meeting with both teams from time to time. Really great ideas. So let's move to the next slide. This is a question you really may want to take back to your E-MDT and say, we've started to recognize there are some areas where we may inadvertently step over our lines, or where there are things that we really can't handle ourselves, but really would like to see handled for lots of different cases and victims. And talk to your team about how they might approach these different issues. So some ideas that occurred to us are, we better do some education of our own members of the E-MDT as well as the CCR on what are their roles, what is the nature of the work, understanding what information each team looks at and addresses, being clear on boundaries around confidentiality and what in fact can be shared. In the CCR, I think bottom line is we're not talking about Ava, we're talking about we've seen situations in which this is a common problem. Elisa, your idea of a designated point person or liaison, really good idea. Developing policies, especially at the E-MDT, for information sharing outside the team. And you should bear in mind what your laws permit, cross trainings, and of course, some fairly obvious things like coordination so that you're not meeting at the same time, but rather maybe, and in some communities, this is the situation is the CCR meets after the E-MDT with a few minutes in between. So those who are only on one can depart and those that need to remain can come back. So, and then finally think about, is there value in having committees and committee structures within the CCR? In wrapping our session up, and Lisa, let's just quickly show them the next two slides. We've provided you with some resources and some websites that may give you more ideas and more information. And so we're going to end in just a moment by inviting any remaining questions, but hopefully we've given you a snapshot of where some of the roadblocks may be and where are some of the hidden dangers. And we want to keep you out of those dangers. And so a little bit of thought, a little bit of planning, and you will do the work beautifully without creating problems for yourselves as you try to go forward. I want to just say thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to the MDT Training and Technical Assistance Center. And thank you to Alicia from NCAL for helping, and Lisa for a wonderful job helping me put this together and allowing me to join you today. Thank you.
I wanted to give a real quick, when I talked about the elder justice locator, that's under the DOJ MDT toolkit, and NCAL has also a toolkit for assessing the CCR that Candy Heisler helped with several years back, looking at various things. If you're curious about what a CCR could do, that has some wonderful resources for that. Are there any additional questions that you have for us on this? We keep in mind, we're gonna have a PLG discussion August 4th. I'm looking at some additional questions around the two. And Candy, if there's something that you think needs to be talked about, you can send that to me. Also, the rest of y'all, if you've got questions, and I'll send it out to everybody who was on this, around E-MDT and CCR and some issues around how we can make that work in a little bit better fashion. We'll be talking about that. Gosh, is August just next week?
It is.
Yes, August is next week. How about that? Here I was thinking it was still March. August 4th, we'll be on that. So let me know if there are any questions that you'd like to have, or come prepared to have that conversation. Anybody else have anything for the good of the cause?
I will just pop in and say thank you everyone for joining us. We'll leave the chat box open for a couple more minutes in case you have additional questions. But I also put the evaluation link in the chat. Please click on that. Let us know how today's session went. And there's also an opportunity there to suggest future topics for webinars and any TA you might have. Thank you for joining us.
And I just want to say thank you, Lisa and Candace, for putting on this presentation today and expanding our knowledge on CCRs and E-MDTs.
Take care, Kylie. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for sticking with us.